Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. To help support our work and these free LOA Live programs by becoming a member, visit loa.org/join. A special welcome to LOA members joining us this evening, and warm thanks to our promotional partners for tonight's program. The Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, the American Historical Association, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, the Museum of the American Revolution, the National Council for History Education, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. The stories we tell about our nation's past shape how we understand the present and the possibilities of our future. The story told and retold about America's founding largely excludes the voices of Black people who lived during the Revolution and the early Republic, people and communities rendered invisible because the written historical record was little known and almost completely unavailable. Black Writers of the Founding Era, a new volume from Library of America, helps change that. This revelatory collection of writings from the crucial decades that gave birth to the United States is edited by James G. Basker with a foreword by Annette Gordon-Reed, who both join us tonight. Black Writers of the Founding Era is published with support from the Berkeley Family Foundation and Betsy Smith. Thanks to their generosity, this volume, number 366 in the Library of America series, will stand as a lasting testimony to the richness and diversity of Black experience in the new nation. And our producers will drop a link to the book in the chat. Information on supporting or permanently endowing volumes in the Library of America series can be found at loa.org/support. Black Americans made outspoken, insightful, and eloquent contributions to the debate about the meaning of the revolution and the future of the new nation. Their writing opens a window onto a vibrant and little-known aspect of American public life during the turbulent decades that created our country. Henry Louis Gates Jr. hails the book as a dazzling rescue mission, and Library Journal calls it extraordinary and unrivaled, vital and necessary. Joining LOA Live to explore some of the remarkable individuals and accounts in the book are two distinguished historians. James G. Basker, editor of the volume, is president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, Richard Gilder Professor of Literary History at Barnard College, and a scholar of 18th century literature on both sides of the Atlantic. His books include a previous anthology for Library of America, American Anti-Slavery Writings, Colonial Beginnings to Emancipation. He joins us from the Gilder Lehrman offices in Midtown Manhattan. Called one of the most astute, insightful, and forthright historians of this generation, Annette Gordon-Reed is Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University, where she teaches in the history faculty and the law school. Her books include The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History, and most recently, On Juneteenth. In 2009, President Obama awarded her the National Humanities Medal. She joins us from her office at Harvard Law School. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, please welcome James Basker and Annette Gordon-Reed. Hello to you both, and thank you so much for joining LOA Live.
Glad to be here.
Hi, Max. Thanks very much.
Let me just start off with like a general question. Jim, maybe could you briefly describe the book? What will readers find here and what may surprise them?
There's so many surprises. Max, as you know, this is the product of about 10 years of research, digging in archives and other early printed sources, about 200 texts chosen from hundreds more from the founding era, 1760 to 1800, writings by every kind of person, free and enslaved, formerly enslaved, people in rural environments, people in urban settings, people in different kinds of work at different stages of their lives. Many different genres, some literary like poetry and occasionally very eloquent essays, many personal documents, private letters that we're so fortunate they survived in archives, and a significant number of petitions. About a quarter of the texts in this book, as you'll see in a minute, are petitions, either by individuals appealing to state legislatures or colonial legislatures, or by large groups of people writing to state legislatures, or in a couple of cases, the national government. But together, they make it possible to see and hear Black people in the founding era, I think, in a way that just hasn't been done before. I'm very excited to have the book out there.
Thanks, Jim. And Annette, I mean, you have a deep knowledge of this period where there's surprises here for you too.
Well, just the breadth of the excerpts of the kinds of, just he's describing the kinds of voices that we're hearing here, people writing to their spouses, poetry, all kinds of things. That the notion of silence, the Blacks being silent in this particular archive is, sort of affected the way people see things, the way people see African Americans today even. And to have this is really, really important.
Thanks. Well, maybe that's a good jumping off place just to go directly into some of these people whose voices are in the book. And we're first going to hear from probably maybe the best known figure in the book. I don't know, Phyllis Wheatley, certainly the largest single contributor to the anthology. And Jim, you've selected a brief passage from one of the poems of hers that's in the book, which I think you're gonna read for us to start us off.
I will, and I'll just say by background to the poem, a lot of us think of, and I'm an English professor, a lot of us think of Phyllis Wheatley as a person of writing in a literary tradition. She is a poet imitating Alexander Pope's style of neoclassicism. But I also see her in this book as a political actor. And one of her most important political poems was a poem she wrote. I'm going to read some lines from it in a moment. In 1775, when she heard that George Washington had been appointed commander-in-chief of the American forces outside Boston, she wrote a poem of praise and patriotic encouragement for the war effort and sent it to him in manuscript. And there's a story that follows from it, but you'll hear in these sort of elevated lines the ardor of her poetic celebration of Washington. Here's some lines from near the end of the poem. One century scarce performed its destined round when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide.
So maybe I should go to Annette first on this one. Annette, what strikes you about these lines, or what strikes you about this poem?
Well, she is writing in a tradition, and that she is putting herself, seeing herself as part of a polity, as a part of the nation, and writing, very unself-consciously about that. And so that's what really strikes me, not as an outsider, as someone who's a participant in the action at the time.
Mm. And Jim, how about you? What's the first thing that strikes you about it? What's significant about the lines to you?
Well, more than the lines is the response of Washington. I think sometimes her poetry is taught in isolation, but Washington received this letter in manuscript in his headquarters in Cambridge, Mass, and wrote a letter of thanks to Phyllis Wheatley, which I think maybe unlike any other letter he ever wrote to a Black person. I'm not sure there are letters surviving that Washington wrote to a Black person. He's very grateful. He's very laudatory, praises the poem. and in almost a socially witty way invites her to come and visit him in his camp. He also took steps a few months later to have this poem published on the front page of the Virginia Gazette, where people were very nervous about the escaping slaves joining Dunmore and the British forces, very anxious about these defections. And then it was published in Pennsylvania in the Pennsylvania Magazine. So he recognized the political power of her writing in his support, and he deployed it in the media. And she went on from there to write many other political poems in support of the revolution.
So here's this, formerly enslaved person and writing a poem to the commander, chief. So I'm a little bit curious how you read the tone of it. I mean, does it strike you as naive? I mean, audacious, naive? You know what I mean? Like, how do you read the tone of the whole address? What's your take on it?
Well, it's very much the voice of a public poet,
Mm.
somebody like John Dryden in the Restoration, praising. But we think of it as audacious, but a lot of Wheatley's poems are addressed to powerful white men. She addressed one poem to King George III. She addressed one to the faculty and students of Harvard. She, in her, quiet, sometimes not so quiet way, was very forthright in writing poetry in the public sphere on public issues.
Yeah. And do you have anything on that, or
No, I mean it just as I was saying before, the ease with which she has put herself in this particular world as a conversation. She's put herself in the conversation with some very powerful people. So it is fascinating to think of someone from that background doing that, having the confidence to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me dig a little into that and just ask you something. So Wheatley uses the word African to refer to herself in some of the poems, and yet in this poem and in many other of the public poems, she's kind of rhetorically, as you were saying, Annette, identifying with the polity,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, when she uses the word race in this particular poem, she's talking about heaven's defended race. She's talking about Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And further than that, as you're saying, Jim, with the Augustan Pope thing, the poem's kind of staking a claim to this kind of transatlantic, British neoclassical tradition. So there's a lot of things kind of going on in the poem in a way.
Mm.
And so I guess I want to push on that a little bit. Like, why is Phyllis Wheatley, celebrating George Washington, the owner of a Virginia plantation worked by hundreds of enslaved people? And why is she celebrating violent separation from England, a country that welcomed her and hailed her as a poet? Like, I'm wondering I guess what I'm wondering is, are we right to notice those ambivalences in the poem? And are they telling us something about ambivalences that are connected to the American Revolution in some way? I mean, you see what I'm asking? She's got a lot of identities going on in and behind the poem, and how do they all relate to each other, and how do you read them?
Well, Jim, you want to go?
No, Annette,
I know I was just going to
good to
say
hear you.
that very ambivalence is what has made her a controversial figure in the Black community for, in the 60s and the 70s. She was not somebody who was admired because of that. What is she doing? Right, insinuating herself into this particular struggle, given her background and the condition of African American people in general during that time period. So, there are schools named after her, but she goes in and out. It's like, I guess, all figures, and Jefferson, everybody, they have their moments. And she's been in periods of times when that kind of thing was not admired. It was seen as problematic because it is too much of a contradiction.
Yeah. But I think we've been lucky. And of course, Annette is part herself of this recovery and deeper exploration of the lives and writings of forgotten figures. Of course, the Hemings family, but Wheatley's had two major biographies in the 21st century and in the last 15 or 20 years. Walt Stryker's recent biography, and before that, Vincent Coretta's. So we know more about her inner life. We know about the complexities and, as Annette says, the ambivalences. She emancipated herself essentially after her trip to London as a literary celebrity, and she was wined and dined in London. The abolitionist Granville Sharp hosted her, and Benjamin Franklin met her, and she was really treated very well. But then she got word that her mistress, her owner back in Boston, was ill, and she'd been raised in that household. She had feelings for the white woman who raised her. Um, and so, urged to come back to Boston, she effectively negotiated her own emancipation because in London, there had been the previous year the Somerset decision, which ruled that you could not compel an enslaved person to leave England once they had landed there. So it tore the power away from slaveholders. She knew she could stay in England and be free. She wanted to go back to Boston to be with the people she knew and cared about. And so she negotiated with her owner's son, who was with her, to get a guarantee that she would be manumitted if she went back to Boston. And so she basically negotiated her own freedom. And that reveals some of the underlying strength of this diminutive woman. She was actually quite forceful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think those various ambivalences and identities actually make the poem fascinating.
Yeah.
So anyway, we could say a lot more about Wheatley, but we have to move on.
Well, I want to say one more thing, which is that it's astonishing to me in this age of great filmmaking and series and so on, that Phyllis Wheatley's life has not been made into a major film. I would love to see that. Such a great story.
So watch, maybe there's somebody on this call who can make that come true. Anyway, let's move to another fascinating figure, Lemuel Haynes. And Annette, you're going to read a brief excerpt. And one of our viewers asked for a page reference because they have the book. So this is page 132 if you have the book.
Well, Lemuel Haynes was a Black clergyman in New England. He's considered to be one of the first ordained minister in the Protestant church, Black minister in the Protestant church. And he's writing, and this is an excerpt from Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping. It's a longer title, but I'm going to stop there. That's the basic gist of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The main proposition which I intend for some brief illustration is this, namely, that an African, or in other terms, that a Negro may justly challenge and has an undeniable right to his liberty. Consequently, the practice of slave keeping, which so much abounds in this land, is illicit. Shall a man's color be the decisive criterion whereby to judge of his natural right? Because a man is not of the same color with his neighbor, shall he be deprived of those things that distinguished him from the beasts of the field? O Christianity, how art thou disgraced? How art thou reproached by the vicious practices of those upon whom thou dost smile? Let us go on to consider the great hardships and sufferings those slaves are put to in order to be transported into the plantations. There are generally many hundred slaves put on board a vessel, and they are shackled together, 2 by 2, worse than criminals going to the place of execution. And they are crowded together as close as possible and almost naked. And their sufferings are so great, as I have been credibly informed, that it often carries off 1/3 of them on their passage. Yea, many have put an end to their own lives for very anguish. And as some have manifested a disposition to rise in their defense, they have been put to the most cruel torture and deaths. And oh, the sorrows, the grief, the distress, and anguish which attends them.
So Annette, what strikes you? Like what strikes you, and what do you think is significant about Haynes and this piece?
Well, using the Declaration, beginning with the Declaration, and making a claim for the unjust nature of slavery based upon the document that is supposed to be America's creed, the founding document. And making that claim, he's a direct challenge to people who claim, to accept the Declaration and the Revolution and changes. This was in 1776 that he's writing this, as a way of saying that slavery is wrong, it is unjust. And linking it to the slave trade is really important because even among the people who considered themselves to be anti-slavery, a lot of the focus was on the trade, the horrible nature of the trade. So he's playing on that, or appealing to that sensibility and understanding of the barbarity of that, and linking it to an American document and making a general claim that it's against the American way as he would see it through the Declaration, but it's also against God, the rules of religion.
Yes.
So that's what impresses me about it, is sort of putting all these things together and sort of like Wheatley in a way, making a claim to the Declaration.
Mm.
I'm so glad, Annette, that you emphasized that aspect of it, building on the Declaration, because one of the things that emerged as I pulled the pieces together in this book, there were at least 5 writings that immediately cited the Declaration very shortly. You'll notice this is the same year that the Declaration was issued.
Mm-hmm.
There's a petition in 1777 where some Boston petitioners cite the Declaration, and there are others. But for me, this re-centered the civil rights movement. We tend to think of it as a modern movement, but I think the civil rights movement begins in the founding era. And the minute that there are these documents like the Declaration that assert certain kinds of rights, Black people say, absolutely, and we're entitled to those rights too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very dramatically present in this volume in many different parts of the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting, Jim. And actually, one thing I wanted to ask about this is, so I find the form of this piece fascinating because it's sort of like structured like a sermon. It has kind of a homiletic vibe.
Yeah.
And yet, instead of a proof text from the Bible, it's got a proof text from the Declaration of Independence at the
Mm-hmm.
top. So it's
Mm-hmm.
this kind of fusion of Christian faith and abolitionist politics. And I wanted to ask you both, I mean, what does that say, not only about Haynes's own approach, but what does it say about the role of the Black church in the early Black anti-slavery movement, and also, in the long arc of the Black freedom struggle? As you were saying, Jim, it's kind of the beginning of civil rights movement, and that it feels that way as well. Could you say something about Haynes's fusion of Christian faith and abolitionist politics? Was that a fundamental part of the early Black anti-slavery movement? And yeah.
Well, yes. And later on, of course, when the abolitionist movement really gets going, religion in the North is really a very big part of it. So those two things are fused in a way that this document, that is a document of the Enlightenment in a way, it's a different version of it because it brings religion into it. Whereas not to say that the Enlightenment wasn't religious, but a figure like Jefferson was skeptical of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for African American people, this was an integral part of it, and it has from the very, very beginning been an integral part of the critique of the American attitude towards Black people. And so this sort of fuses, brings religion into an Enlightenment document in a way that Jefferson probably, I mean, he talks about the creator and so forth, but it's not like this. It's not like the clergyman here who is fusing those things in a very, I think, effective way.
Mm.
I'd like to add to that, and it's so spot on. When Haynes wrote this, he's a soldier outside Boston, and he'd go on to fight at the Battle of Ticonderoga. In other words, he's an American participating in the Revolution. And this document, he's participating in the political life of the Revolution as well, just like Wheatley in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's great that Haynes went on to be a minister, but the other thing I want to say, the irony is he was a minister in predominantly white churches for about 30 years in Vermont and later upstate New York. But to the point about religion, very few Black people, some in the North, were accepted into white churches. But the other thing that happens in the documents in this volume um, is that Black people felt excluded or discriminated against in many of the established churches and started their own.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great strengths you see in this period, people like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen
Mm-hmm.
in Philadelphia, but also some of the Baptists down in South Carolina and Georgia, starting their own congregations, organizing their own communities, their faith communities, and so on. And religion was tremendously important, so that you can also trace a line from the importance of religion in the public sphere. This was the religious communities where people could organize their ideas and their communities and take political positions, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
in the larger society.
Mm-hmm. And, religious organizations were places where Black people could have authority and have respect. And as you're saying, Jim, politics were a part of that. Politics and religion, all of these things are mixed together because they are outside of, of organized or, the mainstream political parties. All of these kinds of things could take place within the confines of the church.
It's really interesting. Well, we have to leave it there and maybe come back.
He's worthy of a film too, though, Max. I want to say
yeah,
he
actually,
did
as a
so many
screenwriter,
extraordinary
there's
things.
a screenwriter in the chat. You'll check in the Q&A says that she's on the case, and
I love it.
okay, we'll
No,
come
I
back.
mean, I know people don't like people. I've often heard a number of African American people complain about slave films or films done during this time period because they're telling essentially the same story, but they're people like this who are doing things that people don't know about,
Yeah,
and would be wonderful to have a film or something about them.
absolutely.
Amen.
Okay, well, our third excerpt is a very different kind of document. This is a private personal letter from Patty Gibson, and it's on page 565 for those of you who have the book. And Annette, I think you're going to read it for us.
She's writing from Pasquotank County, North Carolina, in November of 1797. Patty Gibson, letter to her husband. Dear husband, I now take this opportunity to inform you that I am well at this time and hope this will find you the same. I should be very glad if you will come and fetch me some money by the 1st of January, as I expect to be sold then. And if you could help me to some money, you will much oblige me, as I have set off once, but got catch and brought back, and put in sail. I hope you will try and do the best for me you can, as I want to see you very much. Remember me to all my friends, and I remain your ever and enshrined wife and well-wisher to this day, Patty Gibson.
So there's an image. The book has images both of some of the writers and also of some of the documents. And here's an image of Gibson's. I don't know if you can see Gibson's letter, and the fine penmanship of the letter suggests someone who was literate. And so what do we know about Patty Gibson?
Max, it's painful. We don't know enough. We found this letter in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. We don't know if she actually gained her freedom. We're very hopeful, partly because the letter was preserved in an abolitionist collection, partly because there were other letters there that named people with the surname Gibson who had recently arrived from North Carolina. So we think they were her relatives in some degree, and have to be hopeful that they raised money and sent it to free her. But she's one of 100 stories where we don't definitively know the outcome, and it's agonizing.
Kind of like a message in a bottle in a way.
Yeah.
So Annette, I mean, unlike Wheatley and Haynes, Gibson, obviously she wasn't a public figure. She wouldn't have thought of herself as a writer necessarily. And her inclusion here, as Jim is saying, is kind of an act of historical recovery. And so, I guess I wanted to ask you, what's the role of more informal, personal accounts like this in a book like this? And what does it add to our understanding of the period and in terms of our understanding of the history of the period and of Black writing in the era?
Well, humanizes people who are human, and it's so easy to have them be invisible the way you were describing in the front, at the beginning of the program. To have the poignancy of this, it makes people think about, you're reading a letter from a person who could, it's just another human being, and you think about yourself and the position that they're in and how you would feel if you were put to the kind of circumstance where you had to write to your husband to try to free you, to keep you from being sold. I'm going to be sold. Think about that. You know that this is going to happen, and the terror and the whole and the sadness that must have brought forth. I think something like this brings slavery home, really, in a very, very powerful way. An intimate relationship with a husband and wife,
Mm.
and of course we know that they're not legally, these things aren't recognized, but the affective, emotional connection comes through very clearly. It is there. Do the best you can for me. And to even reach out to a husband in that way, to know that he's going to try to do the best he could, is just very poignant. That kind of, when you read stories about people, the separation of families, which was the thing that really, the part of slavery that was the most crushing, being whipped, being, made to work for no pay. Those are horrible things. But the idea of separation from your family was the real fear, and the thing that was induced the most pain. And this letter, short, is just very poignant. It brings all that home in a very, very powerful way.
Just
I
like
want to add to that
getting.
only, I so agree with every word that Annette just uttered. There are fewer women than men in this book, but there are more than 20. And very often, no surprise, I know Annette won't be surprised, the central struggle is about family,
Mhm,
either a husband or especially children,
mhm,
children who they're being separated from, children who've been taken away from them or are in danger of being taken. Um, Over and over again, stolen children is a motif in so many of the documents. I mean, you could even consider Wheatley in that vein.
mhm,
But the humanization is what matters to me most. And I think I told you this once, Max, but I counted the number of names of people that surface in these 200 texts. And whether as signers or people mentioned in the text or recipients of letters, there are more than 700 individuals whose names are preserved in these documents.
mhm,
And there's a real chance that they would not be in recorded history at all,
mhm,
except for the survival of this document.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and that's what I care about, bringing these people back to life. They were part of us in the founding era. And as Annette says so eloquently, they were in danger of disappearing. They were just left
mhm,
out.
Yeah.
mhm. And now that they are recorded, it's, who knows how many this might happen to, but it's possible that other research could be done. I mean, that there might be leads to things. It's just, but you have to start having this base of them, down on paper somewhere, that you might be able to go further. But even if not, just to remember them for
Well,
what
that's
they tell
exactly
you
right.
about this institution, that this
I
letter,
hope
what it says about the institution.
And Annette, I hope that's what happens. To get off my filmmaker hobby horse for a minute, I'm also hoping that genealogists and local historians and people who care about recovering life stories
Mhm,
will dig into archives and start from the paper trail that some of these people present in this book, because I think we can bring a lot of people much more fully back to life.
mhm,
Well, I hope the fact that Patty Gibson's letter was preserved means that it fell into the hands of people who cared about her. I
mhm,
guess we'll
mhm.
never know that for sure. Um, Jim, I'm gonna turn to you for our last figure, our last excerpt from a petition from some people in Philadelphia.
I'm going to read this, and for me, I chose this because for me, it's one of the most extraordinary documents in the book. And in some ways, it's a pivotal document in American history. It's a petition written in 1799 by exactly 71 Black men in Philadelphia and presented to the U.S. Congress, which was then sitting in Philadelphia. And so the excerpt here, and it's only one paragraph of quite a substantial and interesting long document. It's entitled "The Petition to the People of Color, Freemen within the City and Suburbs of Philadelphia, to the President, Senate, and House of Representatives of the United States." One passage, but it's the one claiming citizenship. In the Constitution and the Fugitive Bill, no mention is made of Black people or slaves. Therefore, if the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Congress are of any validity, we beseech that as we are men, we may be admitted to partake of the liberties and unalienable rights therein held forth, firmly believing that the extending of justice and equity to all classes would be a means of drawing down the blessings of heaven upon this land, for the peace and prosperity of which, and the real happiness of every member of the community, we fervently pray. Signed by 71 men, all whose names were at the bottom of the original.
So page 616, I'm sorry for those who are reading. So, you know, what they're asking for doesn't seem so remarkable. You know, it seems like a reasonable request. So what's remarkable about this document, Jim?
Well, there are two things I would point to. One is textual, and we included in the illustrations a reproduction, in facsimile, of the signatures.
Right there.
Because the 71 men who signed, 21 of them were literate and could sign their own name. But there were 50 more who could not write, but insisted on having their names on it, which was probably a dangerous thing to do. They had an X, and then a clerk or someone filled in their name around the X, but they wanted their names on this petition. To me, that's quite remarkable. It's so bold. And the second thing is that this petition was actually taken up in Congress. I mean, you think ahead to the gag rule with John Quincy Adams and all the attempts to stifle any efforts on behalf of enslaved people. It was taken up in Congress and debated for 2 days. It was presented to Congress by Congressman Thatcher from Massachusetts. It was debated for 2 days. There are some records of speeches made. It was absolutely excoriated by especially Southern congressmen, calling it a sort of a French conspiracy and crazy fanatical liberalism and so on. And then in a disastrous vote, it was voted down 85-1. But I feel it's one of the great lost opportunities in American history. Here was a bill, a chance for the National Congress to do something about slavery and about civil rights for Black people at a moment where the slave power had not become the monster that it would be later in the 19th century. And in fact, when some northern states had abolished slavery or had gradual emancipation acts, the Northwest Territory officially wasn't open to slavery. If Congress had found a way to act differently, our whole history would have been different.
Well, Ned, I'm curious what you think about this. And I would also say that the authors of this document, and it's a roll call. I mean, you know, if you look at it, you see that it's a roll call of many of the names that appear elsewhere of distinguished, you know, figures. But it's an early position, you know, maybe the earliest we have on a question debated throughout the 19th century and still controversial, which is the Constitution a pro or an anti-slavery document? The authors of this document take a very strong position on this, and I'm curious what you think the implications of their position are. I mean,
well, you know, it's mixing the Constitution and the Declaration together, two very different documents. I mean, you're right. There is a debate that's ongoing about pro-slavery versus anti-slavery Constitution. It protects the right to, you know, to recapture fugitive slaves, the 3/5 clause, all those kinds of things. But the idea that it was inspired by and connected to a declaration that's part of a creed as well is something that people like this people in the African American community have been doing from the very beginning. I think the issue that it raises is the question of race. I mean, we talk very often about slavery as if that is, I mean, it was the problem, but there was a problem of a racial hierarchy as well, so that even people, African Americans who were free, weren't slaves. You know, the status of blacks had to be kept second class on the part of the Southerners, because slavery was racially based. And so you see the workings of a notion of white supremacy that responds to this in this particular way, because no black in the country can be treated as an equal person in order to maintain the system of slavery in the South. And also because people in the North passed gradual emancipation statutes, but whites were not so keen on black people. So this really shows you that the question of blacks' place in the polity was up for grabs at this particular point, and with blacks insisting that they were a part of it, and the rejection, not because they were enslaved, but because they were black. And so the racial question gets put here, I think, in pretty sharp relief because of the response to this. I'm not surprised that they did it. I mean, it was courageous for them to do it, because many of these people had been patriots, and they participated and supported the revolution and so forth. But there was, for some people, no place for them because they were of a different race. So we began to see how that aspect of it is going to affect African Americans people's lives, from, well, until today.
It's impressive to me that they're textualists, so we talk about these things today, but they point out that there's no mention of being black or white
It's just there.
Yeah.
And of course, they're human beings, and so we should be a part of this as well.
Amen. Amen. This was all going to get worse too. I mean, Annette knows, and I'm sure she teaches. At the beginning of this volume, in my introduction, I started with the Dred Scott case, which is infamous, of course, in American history, for what it said, effectively that slavery could be extended into free states and free territories and still be an institution. But also, what Justice Taney tried to do gratuitously in that decision was to basically expel black people from the American body politic. And he claimed that without foundation, he claimed that blacks were not included in the political life of the country at the founding. They were not encompassed under the Declaration or the Constitution. And it was basically his attempt to sort of remove the whole issue. He wouldn't have blacks in his court again because they weren't citizens. They couldn't bring these petitions. And he was rewriting history to eliminate black people from our founding story, which is why I started the introduction to the book with Taney, and then with Lincoln's response to him denying his arguments. But to Annette's point, this has been an ongoing issue, reaching a crisis point in the 1850s, but really since the founding.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So let's just step back now for a second, and we've heard these four voices, and ask, how can the writing in this book, change the story we tell about America's founding? Like how would you talk about that? I mean, how would you, if these writings, I mean, the Library of America, it's like, the last 40 years, the books that so far you can read about this period in the writings of the founders, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton. You can read, a multivocal anthology of the pamphlet debate. You can read the debate on the Constitution, and now you have this volume alongside those volumes. And I'm wondering how you think having this volume reframes the story they tell in a way.
Well, the stories have to be integrated because they were. All of these things were happening. The world wasn't separated out into our little distinct things as the history was going on. All of these things were happening at the same time. And so I think this brings us, it's another piece of the puzzle. that you can put together. I mean, right now, I know of 3 books where people are writing about African American people and the Enlightenment. And with respect to Jefferson and other things, their participation in creating our understanding of the Enlightenment. It's really African, the thesis of a couple of them is it's really African Americans who are making that point. And so by looking at all of these writings, we can integrate the story in a way that makes it makes it realistic and it's more historical.
I love that word integrate too, because Max, I wouldn't put this volume alongside all those writings of the white founders. I'd put it right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
I would put it right in the middle of that shelf of founders. And the other thing I would say, and here I'm borrowing an idea that Skip Gates has influenced me, but as Annette said earlier, we've tended to have one sort of reductionist story about Black life in the founding era, that it was the misery of enslaved people on plantations. But I think as a result of looking at this volume closely, generalizations of that kind just aren't possible anymore. Mm-hmm. There are people in this book who fight in the Revolutionary War on the American side. There are people in this book who went to the British side and later went to Nova Scotia and London and Sierra Leone and even Jamaica and wrote about their lives afterwards. Mm-hmm. So there are people of different political views, different personal circumstances, people who were community organizers, people who lived many different kinds of lives and wrote and said and felt many different things. And I, for one, don't feel I can ever generalize about Black life in the founding era ever again.
Mm-hmm. And that's critical. That's crucial.
Well said. Okay, well, we have a few minutes left for some questions, and there are a lot of them. So there are, I'm going to kind of try to group them together if I can. So several people ask about teaching and teaching students, not surprisingly. And so Susan Strauss of Surrey, British Columbia says, how can we ensure that students learn honest history? Shirley Barnes from Washington, D.C. says, what's an appropriate age to teach young people these kinds of historical documents? I'm going to group them together. Professor Maya Hargett of Massachusetts, of Bakersfield, California says, is there a learning curriculum to supplement the book? And I'll let Jim address that. Yvonne Freer of Spring, Texas says, how you get students more interested in this period of history. And Franklin Oliver of Indianapolis says, which materials are most vital? I guess I would broaden all these questions and say, how would you make these pieces come alive for students? Like how would you approach teaching? I guess which ones might you choose to teach? And how would you make it come alive for students in the classroom, this material?
Well, I mean, people like people. The stories of individuals captivate young people. I got into history reading about people's lives, the life of Jefferson, the life of other, people who were enslaved. So I think like the letter that I read from, the husband, for the wife to the husband, personalizing those kinds of things is a way into larger subjects. And so I think that would be a way of doing it. What do you think, Jim?
Oh, I completely agree. The 18th century is the period of life writing. It's when the two genres, biography and the novel, get invented or come into their own because they tell the stories of people's lives, some fictitious and some real. And so these materials help us to see the lives of these people. I think teachers will be brilliant at finding individual texts in this book that work in the classroom, depending on age group. But and Annette joins me in this. I want to brag for a minute. For all the great things Annette does in her life, she is also a trustee of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and she helps us in our work trying to reach teachers, 90,000 of them across the country, and through them to put this kind of historical material in front of students. And I'm eternally grateful to her for that help. But we sent copies of this book, as you know, Max, with your help, to 5,700 schools. I'd like to send copies to all 100,000 schools in America. There are texts in the book that can be used with sixth graders. There's a poem that Lemuel Haynes wrote called The Battle of Lexington. He arrived at Lexington just a couple of days after the battle, so he undoubtedly heard about it from other soldiers. But that poem, 37 stanzas long, is perfectly intelligible to any child of 9, 10, 11 years of age, and it should replace Paul Revere's Ride. Because Longfellow's kind of romanticized version, the white version of the launch of the American Revolution, here's virtually an eyewitness, a black man on the battlefield writing that poem. And it's, by the way, I think the first battlefield poem in American history. And we haven't known about it until we got, see the manuscript and can produce it here in this volume. There are others like that. The letter that Annette read, I think any middle school child could relate to that with total empathy. And there are many, many others that are comparable. I think teachers will be the best judges of what to use, but it's all about getting children and high school kids to feel what these lives were like. Maybe even to invite them to imagine more, set an exercise where you imagine more details of this person's life from what you have in front of you.
Thanks. So Julian Flesh asks, how did Black writers in the founding era influence the thoughts and ideas and writings, particularly anti-slavery writings of Black writers in the antebellum and Civil War eras? And there's a related question from Melissa Dow from Irving, Texas, who asks, what kind of impact did the writings of these authors have in their own day? Wheatley caught the attention of policymakers. Did others draw that kind of attention? In other words, to what extent are we discovering these writers, and to what extent are we rediscovering them? And maybe we don't know. I don't know how.
There's no simple answer to that,
Yeah.
Max, from my point of view, because there are countless different outcomes. Some of these documents survived in manuscript and are really just being published now. Others are taken from printed sources, and they had, I have to believe, some impact. There's a letter from a Black man in New York called William Hamilton to John Jay when he's the governor of New York. And it's denouncing slavery in New York and urging Jay to do what he can to end it. Well, Jay was a member of the Manumission Society in New York City, and then he was governor of New York when the Gradual Emancipation Act was passed. It's hard for us to say how much influence there was receiving letters like that from the Black community, but there's no question that there was pressure on community leaders from individuals in the Black community. The question about Black people in the 19th century is a little more complicated because some of the leading activists of the early 19th century were the children of these people. The family of James Forten, for example, were very active in Philadelphia all the way down to the 1840s and 50s. But again, these documents were not widely circulating, as part of the political literature of the 19th century.
Right. Well, there was actually a question about that too. It was asking, were there, publications or circulars that circulated among Black communities in this period? In other words, how did these writings get out into the world?
Well, Annette knows this world very well. Some of the writings did circulate community to community. There were mutual aid societies in cities like Newport and Providence and Boston and Philadelphia and so on, and they communicated with each other and shared ideas, sometimes welcomed visitors back and forth. And then the print culture of the time, the newspapers and magazines, is where a lot of this material was published, and so was visible to the general public. So again, it varies text to text.
Yeah.
How it's circulated.
Okay, well, we're coming up on our hour here, so I guess I'll just ask you one last thing. Jim, you alluded to this before in your answer about the response to the Philadelphia petition, but you know, I guess the big question is, what, what were the consequences of not incorporating, to ask it in the largest way, Black Americans into the body politic from the very start of this nation? I guess another way of saying that is, how might the history of our country been different if these writers had been heard?
And that you have a vision, I'm sure.
Well, the counterfactual history, you would think that we would not have had the kinds of struggles that we've had since then. On the other hand, the Southern slave power was pretty recalcitrant. And a lot of the stuff that happens um, that are affecting us are the direct result of that conflict. So I can't say that if these the things that were pre-Civil War things that we have here had been published and people had known about it, it would have changed their minds about it. I think it might have changed the minds of some people about African Americans, about the nature of African Americans' connection to the United States. But we are a product of this time period, but we're also a product of the things that happened after the war. And Southerners became white Southerners became really determined to rule over Black people the way they had as enslavers. So, I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic or anything like that, but I mean, I do think it would have changed. We would have known, African American people, we knew that we had stories and so forth, but it would be verified much more than it has been up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so many ways to think about that. That in the 19th century, as slave narratives proliferated, eyewitness personal testimony about the horrors of slavery in the South, the Southern states passed censorship laws, one after another, trying to ban that literature. So in an ironic way, they were conceding the power of literature like this by trying to shut it down and keep it out. There are documents in here that make you feel the precariousness of the circumstances and how things could have gone another way. There are petitions in South Carolina, for example, where Black farmers, farm-owning Blacks, are petitioning the state government in the 1790s for relief from discriminatory poll taxes. In other words, everybody was taxed, and then Black people were taxed for being Black. Additionally, per head in their household. Two of the petitions were submitted 1793 and another date. They were countersigned by equal numbers of white farmers in the same communities. And to me, that was a hopeful sign that just got squashed because, of course, there was no relief from poll taxes. But there was a moment where the white farmers in that community were willing to sign a petition on behalf of their Black neighbors because they felt the poll taxes were unfair. Those poll taxes continued until the Civil War. So those are the things you look at and you say, gosh, locally, nationally, what might have been different? I think some of it still lives on some of it, all of it lives on in our own time. And one dramatic example for me are the thousands of soldiers who fought in the American Revolution, Black soldiers. We still don't know exactly the number, but 5,000 at least, maybe 8,000. And I did a calculation where basically I estimate that there may be 5 million people alive today who could, if they knew their family histories thoroughly, could claim descent from soldiers who fought in the American Revolution, and how that might reorganize our sense of social hierarchy in America. That all of these Black Americans are founders. I'm descended from immigrants who came in the 19th century. I'm a newcomer here. But think how our political and social consciousness would change if these people were embraced as founders from the beginning.
I think that's true. I think that's changes the story. It's not a white. It was never just a white country.
Right.
And this makes that plain.
Yes, and the book does that as well. I mean, the book does that work also. So anyway, it's fascinating. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Really grateful to you both for a really fascinating conversation. You've been listening to Annette Gordon-Reed and James Basker discuss Black writers of the founding era. a revelatory new volume from in Library of America, edited by Professor Basker, with a foreword by Professor Gordon-Reed. Please join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Wednesday, March 6th, LOA Live welcomes New York Times columnist Dan Barry, MSNBC's Mike Barnicle, and New York Times bestselling author Mike Lupica for a conversation about Jimmy Breslin, the larger-than-life New Yorker who raised deadline journalism to literary art. The program marks publication of Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings, volume number 377 in the Library of America series, edited by Dan Barry. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Black writers of the founding era and LOA's Breslin edition, and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. If you're watching on YouTube, click subscribe to stay up to date on all our video programs. The free monthly LOA Live series is made possible by support from Library of America members and viewers. Please consider joining as an LOA member. You can learn more at loa.org/join. Thank you so much again to Annette and Jim for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.